Good day, everyone, and welcome to Nemertes' Emerging Technology Series, and thank you for joining us today. With me today is Marc Seybold, who is a former CIO at SUNY Old Westbury and has been also the head of the Council of CIOs for SUNY as a system. And I'm John Burke, CTO at Nemertes, and our subject today is blockchain. So we're going to start with a very basic introduction to blockchain. Should be more of a refresher than an intro for most folks who are joining us today. And we will then work our way through topics including consensus algorithms, distributed autonomous organizations, distributed applications in Web3, and some futures for blockchain and why we should care. And let's start, of course, with blockchain. In a nutshell. And there's a strong tendency to stray from conversations of blockchain into conversations about cryptocurrency, but it's important to remember that cryptocurrency is one application of the idea of a blockchain, and that a blockchain is a separate technology that can be used for multiple purposes. It is at heart a distributed information store, a ledger with strong protections against alterations of the data once it's committed to the blockchain, and strong controls on how information is added to the blockchain. And it's called a chain because each new block that's added to it points back to the previous block in the chain. And the idea is that strong protections against data alteration amount to the idea that once a block has been closed and added to the blockchain, it is for practical purposes immutable. The way it typically works, and this is not the only way it works, but the way it typically works right now is that blocks are added to the blockchain as the result of a proof of work process. So that there are some nodes that are part of the blockchain system that take a bunch of data that needs to be put on the blockchain, usually financial transactions when you're talking cryptocurrency, create a hash of that data, and then search for a number called the nonce value that, when you hash it together with the hash of the data, hits a certain target condition. And that's, most often that it is greater than or less than some threshold value. When that condition is met, the block can be added to the blockchain. It's then the case that those nodes that are participating in the system start accumulating more data to put into a new block and looking for the nonce that will allow them to put it onto the chain as the next node. So that's, in a nutshell, the way a blockchain functions. And the point is, it's not trivial to put a new block of data on the blockchain, and that once you've put a block of data on the blockchain, it's very hard to tamper with that data. We won't say impossible. There are vulnerabilities, but they're pretty high hurdles to leap over to get to the point where you can tamper with it.
Yeah, John, one point that's worth adding is that from an ideation and marketing point of view, blockchain and the cryptographic protocols for cryptocurrency are different conceptually. But from a technologist point of view, somebody that's interested in actually coming up with an application that exploits or uses blockchain, they're one and the same. I mean, the NFTs are a really good example of that. NFTs use all of the coding and math that are involved in cryptocurrencies. In fact, it's identical. There is no distinction. The only thing is that the NFT now represents a title or proof of ownership of some physical or intangible work instead of being a Bitcoin or Ethereum. So I think it's worth it for people to keep that in mind, that if you're going to try and implement this technology, the two are inseparable. And a lot of the proof, we'll get to some of this stuff later with the zero knowledge slides, but the things that allow anonymizing and proofs of ownership, they're intimately tied to the cryptographic protocols and the outputs of the coin. So they're not separable at a technology level.
Exactly so. Yes, as Marc was just saying, There are applications well outside the space of cryptocurrency. And even within that space, there's lots going on that isn't Bitcoin, the most famous of the cryptocurrencies, or Ethereum. And some of the most interesting things we're seeing are in the physical world, where blockchain is being used, for example, as a way of verifying the authenticity of IoT devices, so that they haven't been tampered with in one direction, and in the other direction, that they know who to accept software updates from. And that's one application that we're beginning to see as folks wrestle with, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of IoT devices that they need to manage state for, and manage state for securely. Another is using the distributed ledger type functionality to help track physical assets, like containers, or even ships carrying containers, as well as people. And we have begun to see some application of the blockchain as a way of undergirding a system of passports, for example, or other kinds of physical identification that people take with them, or use to prove their actual identity or their right to be in a given place. And Marc, I don't know if you have any further thoughts on that score before we move along.
No, I think the applications that pop up are the ones where you want to be able to easily do chains working backwards. So customs and immigration at airports is probably a really good example of that. Railroad cars. I mean, the shipping tracking container is actually a startup that's explicitly focused on that, but there are way more railroad cars floating around in the world than there are shipping containers. And a lot of times they're actually one and the same. They're shipping containers that happen to be put on a railroad car. So there's a certain natural flow to applications that are optimal for these things, and that will be the first ones to come online. And then after those are proven out, we'll start to see the more esoteric ones, and the ones that nobody can imagine.
Yep. I've seen discussions about applying it in the vaccine management space as well, for example. So yeah, there's lots of possibilities where you want broadly distributed and visible information that can't be tampered with. Cryptocurrency is, of course, the hottest and most frightening in some ways application of it. And of course, I'm contractually obliged to say something exciting and scandalous and controversial at this point, like Bitcoin is a scam, it's a Ponzi scheme, it's tulipomania. And yeah, you guys should all go look up what that is. But I'm really just kidding. Cryptocurrency is a perfectly legitimate thing to do. Bitcoin is a perfectly legitimate cryptocurrency. I mean, it can certainly be misused, but so can any other currency, blah, blah, blah. Just checking in really to see if you're with us so far. And actually, I see that we've got a question that's come up in the Q&A tab. I'll encourage everybody, as questions occur to you, throw them up in the Q&A tab. Marc, we've got a slide coming up on consensus algorithms, and we should talk about this question in that context. But yes, please loft us questions in the Q&A tab, and we'll get there, and we'll get to the consensus item in just a moment. It's just, I think, important to keep track of the fact, and Marc, I'll hand off to you here, that there's lots going on in blockchain currently.
So this is a quickie update on the most current news. Google's actually setting a blockchain unit, so I guess that it's finally arrived. There's an academic paper published about 2 months back that actually showed quantum computers are still far away from being able to break the Bitcoin proof of work encryption. I think the actual date was pushed out to something like 2030 or beyond. So that's the quantum computers don't look like they're an immediate threat to the blockchain, unlike other encryption algorithms that are going to be vulnerable much sooner. Sequoia Capital of India led a $450 million investment in Polygon, which is one of the polychain companies. And in fact, they were recently in the news because they were on one end of the wormhole bridge that just had a breach of that cost them $320 million. SoftBank is also going to take on a Coinbase DriveWell. They're coming out of old school brokerage companies, and so they see the trend for the transaction fees is unsustainable under Coinbase. The retail end for Coinbase is, I think, over or slightly above 4.5% each way, plus an arbitrage spread and some function that I'm not sure is public in terms of how they take a percentage of the actual volume amount. Can't say dollar. I'm not sure what the right word is for that yet. The numbers we're at for 2021, DeFi thefts topped $10 billion, and that's numbers that were put out in public. We don't know if the private losses are even higher than that. Pilot Chain and two services keep growing and multiplying. They're intermediaries. They're attempting to solve the transaction volume and per second numbers for the blockchain. So both Ethereum and Bitcoin have fairly poor numbers, extremely poor if you compare them to, say, current credit card processing systems. And the current solution is to use layer 2 services that act as intermediaries and provide instantaneous or near instantaneous confirmation of the transactions. They roll those up into individual blocks and kind of act as a temporal buffer between the issues that are going on in the underlying blockchains. NFTs are kind of interesting. There's been some spectacular data losses where currently NFTs basically have as little as a URL link that points to whatever the virtual work was. And some of these things were paid, I think, over $1 million, and the actual URLs became non-functional. And so it's beginning to be driven home in a very painful way that you're going to have to store the actual data on the blockchain. It's not going to be enough to simply have a token that points to something else. Technology isn't friendly at all. There was a recent Reddit thread where somebody lost $500,000 because they weren't clear on just what exactly was happening when you translated one coin into another. In this case, it was an old Ethereum coin into a new Ethereum coin, and they accidentally sent it through twice, thinking that would achieve what they were after, and instead, poof! When they sent it through a second time, the coins were burned, and there is no recourse. And that's a problem in general that doesn't seem to be getting a lot of attention. I mean, in the current financial system, transactions for the most part like that can be rolled back. If you accidentally made an error in a banking transaction of $500,000, say like on an accounts payable or something like that, you'd be able to undo it. Right now, there doesn't seem to be any mechanism for undoing these things, or we wouldn't be hearing about these stories. And if people are doing a lot of work on this, it's not something that's receiving a lot of publicity. And that may be one of the gotchas with the whole concept of centralizing finance as opposed to things, because finance has those peculiar requirements. I mean, how do you undo an oops?
Exactly, and governments often have something to say about that.
Yeah, lots and lots of regulations. It's probably the main reason why you can undo an oops right now.
Oh, indeed.
The transaction through a bank. Yeah. So blockchain issues. You got transparency of data and linked transactions, right? They're both the strength and the weakness. The strength is the ability to do data mining against them. So if it really did turn into an environment where large parts of the data stream were converted to blockchains and made public, and that's a key part of it, then all of a sudden AI data mining becomes viable. And from an economic point of view, it means it'd be a much better sense of what was happening to the economy at a detail level. If you were looking at things, say, like foreign exchange, all of a sudden, if all of the transactions for commodities and settling current accounts between countries around blockchains, you could work backwards to the real value of currencies, because now you've got a barter exchange value for all of the goods and services that are moving back and forth, and that could become the basis of how to deal with FX. So there's some interesting, not sci-fi, but futures-looking possibilities there. Private blockchains, we're seeing more than those pop up. Aside from the fact that they violate the original concept of Satoshi, that the whole point of this was not have any centralization, you get into a cascading series of problems, because once you're a monoculture, all of a sudden say something, any of the proofs approaches that are being used, right? The consensus algorithms, how much value do they still have when a single entity controls the entire blockchain? Another problem that pops up is if one entity or a consortium of entities controls 51% of the mining for that blockchain, then it's able to actually alter existing transactions in it. And that's a deal. Now, there are probably cryptographic methods maybe involving zero proof that could work around that. But again, they're not something that you're seeing a lot of discussion. Post-quantum crypto security. So we've got the good news on that it looks like we're 10 years away from a serious problem there, but it doesn't mean that we can stop worrying about it. If blockchain and crypto keeps going in the direction that it is with exponential growth, and we wait until 10 years from now to do something, we're all going to be in a lot of trouble. Because especially remembering that the blockchain is supposed to be immutable and it's out there in public means it'll be possible to decode everything that's there, and it'll be a decade's worth of information. So proof of stake, the consensus algorithms, the zero knowledge ones, we're going to talk about that in a little while. But the problem with the current proof of work is well known. It's basically using an enormous amount of electricity. It's not very eco-friendly. It imposes severe limitations on transactions per second, all that good stuff.
And it drives a re-centralization of participation in blockchain based on being able to get together the resources to actually participate in blockchain, at least the blockchain behind a particular currency. So it also works counter Satoshi in that sense. It pushes a re-centralization.
Well, here's an interesting thing. When you dig into that topic, the centralization tendency basically comes out of the fact that you're providing financial incentives to the miners and the people that actually provide the equipment to have the blockchain. And so that's a really wide open topic, because any system that provides an incentive is inevitably going to result in centralization. And oddly enough, the lower you can make the cost of mining those coins and setting up the blockchain, the more it pushes centralization, because the argument's pretty simple. If, let's say, you're getting $10,000 if you happen to win the lottery to mine a block, right? So that encourages a lot of individual people. Half the world is going to set up, a PC server in their basement and go ahead and mine. But now suppose that you're getting a fraction of a penny for it. All of a sudden, there's no incentive for it. The incentive is for a small number of massive organizations with data centers like Facebook, Google, et al. To go ahead and do it. And that's something that people are having a hard time coming to terms with, that there is a libertarian aspect of blockchain that wants to see this totally distributed, but then the financial realities of providing that infrastructure tend to push it in the complete opposite direction. So here we're going to talk very briefly about the consensus algorithms. So proof of work is something many people have heard of. It's the original Bitcoin one. So very succinctly, it's solving a complex mathematical problem, something that requires significant resources and that couldn't easily be faked. Proof of stake essentially says that I'm going to put up some asset. In most of the cases, it's coins. But these things have to have value. Otherwise, proof of stake is kind of meaningless. And it goes back to what happens in the monoculture. So if you're looking for consensus algorithms, what does it mean to me for somebody that owns the entire blockchain to be proof of stake? And it'd be kind of interesting to figure out what exactly is valuable to put up there. And then that goes down to the zero proof knowledge, or zero knowledge proofs, which seems to be the thing that a lot of people are betting to get us out of this whole mess. So when you go on the web and try and find what's a zero knowledge proof, most of the answers are fairly basic. They're giving you the examples that boil down to 1 + 1 = 2. And the classic examples are, let's suppose that you want to prove that Coke and Pepsi taste different, right? So how do you do that? You've got one person that knows one of the two drink poured into the glasses, right? And they put one in each hand. Now they put those glasses on their back, They either change the position or not, but they still know which one is which. Now they bring them forward and they allow us to taste them. They do that a couple of times and they ask that person, did I change the glasses in my hand or did they remain the same? And then they put them behind their back. Maybe they keep them the same or they shuffle them, they bring them back in the front. And that's a probabilistic proof. If you do that enough times, the other person is going to be able to right away, are these in fact the same or are they not? And so that's the simple version of the zero knowledge proof. I've got some papers that link to, if I can find where I had just prepped that. Hold on a second. Okay. So I just posted in the announcements, Actually Explore has got 2 really nice survey papers on zero knowledge proofs. And when you go through them, they're not for the faint of heart. The complex math. I mean, that's why the public examples are all really simple. And the level of detail that gives good explanations are really aimed at the people that either have to figure out whether or not these things are provably correct, or they've got to actually implement them in systems. There are many other kinds. But the helium uses an interesting one called, I think, proof of coverage. They might have simply made that one up, and we'll talk about that one a little bit when we get over to them.
Marc, this would probably be a good place to ask about the permissioned blockchains question, and what about systems that don't require consensus?
So, I mean, this is personal opinion, right, at this point. If you remove the consensus requirements from blockchains, what are you actually left with? You're left with a database.
It's a distributed database, and in some ways not going to be anywhere near as efficient as things that were designed to be distributed databases in the first place, with a permission structure as opposed to a consensus structure.
Yes, you have to ask for doing that. As opposed to using an actual database.
Exactly, and there are plenty of distributed databases out there already, built over the last 25 years to solve different kinds of distribution problems, optimized for performance or what have you.
Right.
So yeah.
Because remember, the point of the consensus algorithms in the blockchain is to ensure the integrity of the data that's going into it. So if you remove that, then there's proof that what's actually submitted to the blockchain is in fact what was submitted.
And that is the whole point of blockchain.
Yeah. So that's the difference. I would say it's a use case. If somebody has a use case that makes sense and doesn't require the guarantee that the information that's encoded in the blockchains are in fact what were submitted, you can move away from the idea of these proof of work, state knowledge, or other ones. But you're giving up the core technology that drives the blockchain.
Indeed. Okay. There's another question here about government approving blockchain as a means of proving user identity. I'm not aware that that's gotten close to becoming a reality. Are you aware of anything along those lines?
No. Do they have a specific example, or it's a generic question?
It is a generic question there, and by all means, if you're the person who asked the question, hop back in and elaborate if you have any elaboration. And everybody else, drop your questions into the chat, and we will bring them up and knock them down as quick as we can once they appear. So we were talking about other use cases, and Marc, I know this is one that's near and dear to your heart, the distributed autonomous organization.
The DAOs. So this may actually be a bigger disruptor than DeFi, because DeFi is limited to a single segment of the economy, finance, which is very big in terms of the dollar units or other currencies that are flowing through it, but it is just one segment economy. You can't have something that's just about money changing hands. There have to be goods and services to make sure that you've got a functioning economy. So what the DAOs do, and they're probably going to come at organizations both from top down and bottom up, is it allows you to have a governance structure that is close to an Athenian democracy is probably the easiest way to describe it, because not only do they include consensus algorithms for arriving at decisions, they've got voting mechanisms. The best of them have actual human arbitration. They've got mechanisms for being able to contest decisions. As few as just one person can actually contest it in an organization. And it's easy to see how companies right now that are fairly small, say like consulting groups, marketing groups, things that deal with intellectual property, legal firms, that kind of thing, where if they wanted to expand significantly beyond where they are now, and in particular become international organizations where it's collections of individuals from all around the globe, then DAOs are a plausible way of moving forward on that. At the other end of it, if you're the CEO of an extremely large corporation, by the time you get to 100, 200,000 people, it's pretty difficult to get any sense of what's really going on inside the company. You're, pick a number of layers, 20 layers away from the people that are the actual ones doing the work out in the field. So DAOs could possibly be coming down from the top, more say like as an advisory system, because those companies are unlikely to give up their hierarchical structure. Even if they think they're flat, they're still a lot more hierarchical than an Athenian democracy would be. But it would be useful to be able to get feedback that doesn't have to go up through a chain of command. And some of the features like the anonymity can be really useful. Not many people are willing to be honest about what's going on when they're in a situation where they can be retaliated against or where they've got to say something publicly. And I don't mean bad things as in, screaming fire in a crowded theater or something like that, but genuine feedback that would be valuable to the people that are running organizations, but they're unable to get them now. And yeah, people, HR does polling with internal and external organizations, but it's not the same thing as what DAOs could do. So that's one of the reasons why it could be more disruptive than the DeFi applications of blockchain, because I see it moving from both directions. The smaller organizations that try and get bigger and have links that are global as opposed to just staying inside one country, and that alone would be transformative. And the larger organizations that would use them as an aid to existing management structures. And sooner or later, things start to bleed out. You're going to have developments that are being driven from both ends, right? From what the smaller organizations need and what the really large ones do. And every time you get that step increase, that iteration, that means that it will be valuable to a larger and larger spectrum of individuals and organizations. And whereas the DeFi applications are always going to be on the money side. That's by heart what they really are.
It actually might see some applications in actual democracy as people start to talk about ways of mediating voting that are different from the way we do them currently.
Right, I didn't even bring it up, but that's a perfect example. I mean, it's blockchains and DAOs are a long way from being useful for national voting in countries the size of the US. But if you get to much smaller organizations, say local church groups, sporting organizations, Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, there's no end of cultural organizations. I mean, I'm on the board of one, and even though we're relatively modest at around 100 plus members, governance is a never-ending issue. Part of it's, personality conflicts that are always going to be involved anytime there are human beings in something. But the amount of scut work that's needed to run organizations is surprising, and that's true for little ones and big ones. And DAOs can take a lot of that weight off of the individuals. Now, the last one I want to talk to you about is Helium, because that one's kind of interesting. So Helium's a company where their business model is to try and provide internet access to IoT devices and as a fee for service. And originally, they started out trying to get people to buy the radio systems themselves, or the base stations. They would hook them to their own ISP account and then make that service available, and Helium would pay them some amount of money proportional to the number of devices that are going through. And they stalled out at around the point when they were running out of their initial startup funding. And they got the brainstorm to try and turn this into a DAO. And because the original use case was spread all around the world and in countries that had very poor infrastructure, so the United States was not, a prime example where we've got easy access to cell phone modems and whatnot. So there was a certain of egalitarianism that was involved in setting up these things on the part of the people that bought the base stations. And so by converting it into a DAO, that pushed it forward. And they actually exploded. I don't remember the total number of radios that they're up to, but it's an impressive number. And because they've reorganized that as a DAO, even if the company itself were sold, the people who actually own the radios, it's individuals, and they're essentially acting as pass-through agents, and then they get a small amount of money, like I said, depending on the number of devices and volume of traffic going through it. Well, anybody who wanted to make radical changes to the company would be stuck, because the DAO could simply decide, you know what, we're just going to turn all of the radios off, and that's the end of Helium. And there's not much that could be done about it, since its whole business model is that individuals own the radio relays and that make money by charging the IoT gadgets. So it's an interesting thing that has very little to do directly with money. You're paid in a Helium-specific cryptocurrency, and I think most people are making something like $7 to $15 a month. So nobody's doing this as a profit motive, really. They're doing it to be able to provide the service.
Right. So got a clarification on the identity management question related to the government. And it was that this person wants to use a blockchain-based identity management approach in a zero trust context, and wants to be able to bid on government jobs. And of course, the government has come down very strongly, very recently, on everybody implementing zero trust in the government. And it's strongly expected that that will then be pushed out successively into all the contracting layers as well. But I don't think that's happened yet. So this is a good question forward looking. I'm not directly aware of any blockchain-based identity and access management systems that are known to be acceptable to the government in its contractors, but I also don't know that there are none. I can only say that I don't know that there are any. Marc, is this something that you've done any reading on?
No, but I can raise a red flag on that would have to be solved before I would see the government use it. And that's that the blockchain is public, and that attempts to anonymize the actual data on it have proven difficult. One of the reasons you see this insane number of cryptocurrencies out there is they're essentially a game of three-card Monty. Where's the face card, or if you want, hide the key under the three cups and move them back and forth. So, especially given the issues that the federal government has had with data breaches from the Chinese and the Russians, anything that involved identity management, it's difficult to imagine that they would be comfortable with the situation where you go backwards through that blockchain and actually ID people. That's going to be an issue.
Yeah.
And there may or may not be effective solutions, but in those IEEE Explore articles, I managed to get through one of them and was browsing the other one before this presentation. The issue of de-anonymizing data that people thought was ironclad anonymous has just come back to bite people for decades now. Every time somebody has come up with a really effective solution to that or methodology, somebody else finds a way to break it. So that's not knowledge of a specific thing, but it's a general consideration if you're going to use blockchains in a place where being able to identify the people and the transactions would present a fundamental issue or challenge.
And something the government definitely wouldn't want in any system that was governing access to software or other systems that you were working on for the government is anonymity. They would definitely not want anonymity. They would want the exact opposite.
Well, John, think about it. It depends on which direction you're going. If it was an internal application, right, where you wanted the identity of people to stay hidden, then you absolutely want anonymity. If, on the other hand, it's an application where people are coming in from the outside to use government services, then depending on what it is, especially if it's a consumer-facing thing with a lot of privacy issues.
That's a very different question from being a government contractor supplying function to the government. But yes, I can see that definitely would be a solid use case. Voting likewise. You definitely want anonymity in that case.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I think the real answer for him, and then we'll move on, is he needs to get clarification directly from the contracting agencies at the federal level. I know that's not, the answer you probably want to hear, but it's the only one we've got.
Yeah. And think about why you would want blockchain to be at the basis of your IAM system. If you're running something that's not a DAO, a distributed organization built around blockchain for all the rest of its core functionality, why would you specifically want to carve out IAM as something that is being controlled via blockchain? It's worth asking in that context, definitely. What you're hoping to achieve that way that's not easier with more conventional tools. So at the extension of the concept of smart contracts and things like DAOs is the idea of actually using a blockchain as a computing platform and running applications on it. And there are some technical, not barriers, but hurdles to get over to make this functional. But really, the thing that you've got to ask yourself is who's going to pay for this, or how are they going to pay for this? Because all that stuff's got to execute somewhere. And if all you're doing is taking over the blockchain nodes that are also, maintaining your blockchain for you and pulling some of their resources aside to execute other kinds of functions for you, that is probably expensive compared to other ways of getting your computing functionality. So the question again becomes, why do you want to do this? And why is this a better solution than doing it in some other infrastructure, either in-house or in a cloud or some other external data center kind of an organizational structure? And if the answer is anonymity, is this the best way to achieve it? If the answer is distribution, is this the best way to achieve it? There's lots of questions, but if you want to provide a sort of peer-to-peer computing platform, like a peer-to-peer music sharing system, then yeah, you've got to think about where those resources are, how many you'll have access to, what kinds of performance expectations you can have in this context, and whether this will in any way improve upon the function that you can get in other avenues and with existing mechanisms for keeping confidential the fact that you're doing this or what you're doing. Marc, you have any thoughts on this? This is one where it looks hard and the motivation's questionable.
The answer to this is the people that are in the best position to provide this kind of service, and don't laugh, but it's going to be Amazon Web Services, Google, Azure, because they're operating at such a scale that it's at least conceivable that you could have something similar to the current web model where advertising picks up the cost of the transactions. But the current blockchain miners are very, very small scale operators compared to the three that I just mentioned. And so they don't have economies of scale on anything, not on the data centers, not on access to power cooling, staff, pricing power to acquire the equipment itself, you name it, up and down. The other part that kind of doesn't get mentioned so much is think about the internal software resources at any one of those three organizations and the kind of software that they've been able to engineer in-house and then release out into the wild. There is nothing like that on the blockchain and crypto level. It's just far fewer people are involved in the software development, and the motivation is completely different. And that's an important part of drive software innovation. It's what is it you're trying to get done? And in the case of blockchain, one of the reasons why DeFi just always circles back to it is that's where the money is. So if DeFi that's got the dollars, what are they going to focus on? Things that make more money for DeFi. And it's not so obvious how the distributed apps, outside of ones that are special purpose to distributed finance, are going to track that software development effort internally.
Yeah. I mean, it's easy to think of it as a way to take all that fallow cycle and memory resource that's sitting out there on people's individual devices and turning it into functioning infrastructure, like we've seen with peer-to-peer sharing, like we saw with SETI at home going way, way back. But at some point, it always does seem to run up against real costs and questionable capacity. Can you rely on it? Do you want to do anything serious on capacity you can't rely on? Anyway,
I mean, here, if anybody's out there looking for ideas, I mean, the true way you're going to see something like this probably go out is if you can figure out how to make it run on cell phones. If cell phone can be the actual norm, I'm thinking about it. There are literally billions of smartphones on the planet. Every single one of them's got an internet connection. And many of them have ridiculous amounts of local storage on them, as well as powerful processors, neural network processors, graphic accelerators. There's a fair amount of horsepower on them.
As long as you can do it without killing the battery, yes.
Yeah, well, yeah, there are some dark clouds that come into every clear sky. But in all seriousness, a technology that would be able to use smartphones as nodes, that's, I think, where you would get explosive growth. And of course, that works backwards. You've got to have something that isn't going to kill the battery, isn't going to, make this thing set your pocket on fire from the heat it generates running something, won't kill all of the memory that you've got, and isn't all of your bandwidth, because in many parts of the world, people still have to pay for bandwidth. It's not unlimited the way it is in the developed countries. But I think that would be a killer app. Somebody figures out how to use cell phones as the distributed node. They're the next Elon or Bill Gates.
It's ripe for development and exploitation. It is part of what folks mean when they talk about Web3, this whole kind of distributed app based on blockchain or something similar. And of course, as we said, there can be some significantly unexpected expenses associated with using these kinds of platforms for the storage and execution of your application code. So that's something that very definitely needs to be kept in mind if you're thinking along these lines, specifically, or along the Web3 lines generally. And of course, that leads to our second, this is a scam slide. Although I was able safely to say that we were kidding when it came to cryptocurrency, I'm not sure we're not kidding. I'm sorry, I'm not sure that we're kidding on Web3 yet. The jury's still out for me as we look for real use cases and real propositions for how it might be structured in a way that isn't a Ponzi scheme, basically, or an externalization of costs and costs side effects. So this brings us to the sort of wrap up part of the discussion. I'm sorry, what, Mark?
No, I was going to say, or a pyramid scheme or a lottery, because I had to laugh when I went looking for tutorials on Ethereum's programming language. Well, practically, it was either the first or third top hit was how to code lotteries.
And that's going to be so much fun. Wrapping up with sorts of looking at these futures and why they matter. One of the things that's important to take away is that there's lots of layers being interposed between end users or businesses and the blockchains that underlie the systems they're using, like Bitcoin. And that while the blockchain technology itself hasn't been breached, all those other kinds of layers have, and tens, hundreds of millions of dollars have been, tens of billions of dollars actually at this point, have been stolen or made to disappear. So it's important to pay attention to the whole ecosystem and not just the fact that there's blockchain at the base of it somewhere. We are looking at a world where shifting from proof of work to proof of stake to things like zero knowledge proofs may dramatically reduce both the dollar cost and the energy and computational cost of having a blockchain, but they could also have implications for its security. So there's a lot to keep your eye on as you move forward with blockchain in your own thinking. And there are lots of ways that you can think about applying blockchain any place where immutable data that is maintained in a distributed fashion could be useful. Those are all places where blockchain may have a stake. And so you should be keeping your mind open as those things emerge and keeping in mind civic applications, including things like watching voting records over time, are some of those non-obvious applications that we should expect to see as we move forward. Marc?
Yeah, so some of the esoteric things that come out is we're living in a world where there's been a general loss of trust, right? Where provenance has become something that's increasingly difficult to verify. If you go back, I don't know, 100, 150 years ago, the average person knew what the real cost of the goods they were buying was because they could make them if they absolutely needed them, or they were only one or two steps away from the manufacturing process. You know, use a trivial example, clothes, right? If you knew how much you were paying for the bolts of cloth and you were actually doing the cutting and sewing yourself, you had a very good sense of what that actually cost in terms of the hours of labor and the raw materials. So if you decided to make the decision, well, I'm going to buy something. Oops.
We're running a little long.
Yeah, that you were going to buy something, you knew what the actual cost was. And in our current model, there's been an almost complete breakdown between what things cost and what they're being charged for, right? And that's at the lot of the income inequality that we see throughout the planet and the different economies. It doesn't seem to make any difference whether the economy is a late-stage capitalist one, the way it is in the United States right now, or if it's the Chinese, whatever you want to call their version of capitalism, socialism, the kind of thing that you see in the Nordic countries, or the kind of cross between that and what we've got in countries like England, France, Germany. The societies right now are breaking down, right? And we see that in the political gridlock. And one of the ways of turning that around is restoring that provenance. And blockchain by itself is obviously not, you know, the all end all of it. But the concept of technology that can restore provenance is what's important. The particular versions of it are not. And so the social impact for that is pretty valuable. And because we're just about out of time, the last slide is you know, come and listen to more of this. Is basically.
Let me jump in and say, yes, you can review the last few minutes of this to see all the content on the last slide. I skipped through there. We are gearing up to do our next round of research. If you're interested in participating, we're going to be interviewing folks on their use of some emerging technologies. There is a survey you can go to. Here is the link to it on this slide. Go there. It'll ask a couple screening questions. And if you're a good candidate, we will get you then a scheduling link. And you can pick a time when we can pick your brain and find out more about how your organizations are deploying emerging technologies for their specific use cases. And with that, from both Marc and myself, thank you very much for your time, for your attention, for the great questions. It's been a pleasure. Goodbye, all.
Thank you very much, and have a great week.